All set.
We're off, right?
Yeah.
Aaron, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, we are having some pretty significant technical difficulties in the conference room. You can't see me. I apologize. Let me turn my video. We are trying to be efficient as a team and it is not working. Apologies to everyone. We are all here in the same room, but we're probably going to have to use individual. We can't get the speaker to work. We're dialed into the meeting. We have it projected, but we cannot hear you guys. And there's a big blob in the middle of our screen that we can't seem to get rid of. So I think we'll just use our own videos. So I don't know.
It sounds good. Do you need a few more minutes to work that out, or are you okay now?
We need to talk logistics about how we're going to do the handoffs because people are going to have to turn their mics on and off.
We can just move the computer. Oh, no.
Or you can play musical chairs and just sit at
Yeah.
chairs.
You, right? Am I off mute now? Okay, I think.
Here through here.
Are we good?
No, there's some echoing.
Is that better?
I think we're good. Is that working?
Yes, I think that's working.
Okay, thanks. We will take a short pause between each speaker to be sure that we mute the right things and unmute the right things. Thanks for your patience. I think we're ready.
Okay, good morning. I'm Aaron Yao. I'm the designated federal officer, the DFO for the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, CASAC. In my role as DFO, I'd like to formally open this public meeting. The CASAC is an independent expert federal advisory committee chartered under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. The CASAC is empowered under the Clean Air Act to provide independent advice to the EPA administrator on the scientific and technical bases for EPA's national ambient air quality standards. FACA and EPA policy require that CASAC meetings be announced to the public in the Federal Register and that substantive deliberations and interactions with EPA and the public be conducted in open sessions where DFO is present to ensure that the requirements of FACA are met. The purpose of today's meeting is for the panel to receive a briefing from EPA on the revised draft policy assessment. The panel will meet again on March 29th through 30th in North Carolina to peer review the PA, and public comments will take place during that meeting on March 29th. For further details, please refer to the Federal Register notice announcing the meeting. Minutes will be prepared to summarize discussions and action items in accordance with the requirements of FACA. I will work with the chair to certify the minutes and have them posted on the CASAC website. For those on the phone, I'd like to note that we have a live video webcast of this meeting, which is available through the CASAC meeting webpage. To those watching the live video webcast, please send me an email indicating your attendance. If you had previously requested a call-in number, you do not need to email me again. I would now like to turn the meeting over to Dr. Leanne Shepard, Chair of the CASAC. Leanne, you're muted.
Thank you, Erin, and welcome to everyone to the meeting of the CASAC Ozone Panel for the purpose of receiving a briefing on the revised policy assessment. As Erin mentioned, our goal today is to learn from EPA about the document and their thinking and to ask clarifying questions. Since we received the materials just yesterday, we're not expected to have had time to prepare in advance for this meeting. We'll start with brief panel introductions, then I will invite EPA to introduce themselves and deliver their presentation. I expect we will take a pause between the sections focused on the primary and secondary standard. Panelists are welcome to raise their hand at any time that you have clarifying questions, and we will certainly take questions between the discussion of the primary and the secondary standard, and then again. But you're welcome to ask clarifying questions at any time. So I'll start with introductions, going through the roster in alphabetical order, and I ask the panelists to turn on their videos when you speak. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Leanne Shepard, the Roman Haas Endowed Professor in Public Health Sciences at the University of Washington School of Public Health. I'm trained as a biostatistician, and my research focuses on understanding the health effects of environmental and occupational exposures, particularly through the lens of exposure assessment design. Now moving to the panel in alphabetical order. First up is George Allen.
Good morning, everyone. I'm George Allen. I'm the chief scientist at NESCOM in Boston. I'm a former chartered CASAC member during the 2010 to 2014 ozone review and the 2011 reconsideration, and a member of several CASAC panels since 2004. My expertise is in measurement methods and exposure assessment.
Thank you, George. Ed Aval.
Good morning. My name is Ed Aval. I'm a former chief for the Environmental Health Division, professor at the Department of Population Public Health Sciences at USC in Los Angeles. My interests and expertise is in exposure assessment and in health effects research, particularly with respect to chronic exposure to children. I have previously served on several CASAC panels, including the 2010 through 2014 ozone review.
Thank you. Michelle Bell.
Hi, I'm Michelle Bell. I'm at Yale University. I'm at the Yale School of the Environment with secondary appointments at the School of Public Health, the Jackson School for Global Affairs, and the Environmental Engineering program. And I'm an epidemiologist who works on different ways that environmental conditions impact human health. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim Boylan.
Hi, everyone. Jim Boylan. I am the Assistant Branch Chief at Georgia EPD's Air Protection Branch. My background is in regulatory air quality modeling, ambient measurements, emission inventory development, risk analysis, and SIP development. And this is my 6th year on the chartered CASAC. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Judy Chow.
Hi, everyone. My name is Judy Chow. I'm the research professor at the Division of Atmospheric Science of Desert Research Institute. We're part of a Nevada system of higher education. My research interest has been on ambient and source air quality monitoring, measurement method, descriptive data analysis, and source apportionment.
Thank you. Mark Frampton.
Good morning. Mark Frampton, Professor Emeritus at the University of Rochester in Rochester, New York, the School of Medicine. I'm in the Pulmonary and Critical Care Division of the Department of Medicine, and my training is in pulmonary and critical care. And my research interest has been the health effects of air pollution using human exposure studies.
Thank you, Mark. Christina Fuller.
Good morning. I'm Christina Fuller. I'm an associate professor at the University of Georgia College of Engineering. I specialize in the fate and transport of air pollutants in the environment, and I also investigate disproportionate exposures and impacts on vulnerable populations.
Thank you. I think Terry Gordon was going to be late. Oh, you are here, Terry. Welcome. Go ahead and introduce yourself. You're still on mute. There you go.
Yeah, Terry Gordon, NYU School of Medicine. Air pollution. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Catherine Carr.
Oops. Sorry.
Mhm.
Having trouble with my buttons here.
Yeah.
Morning. I'm at the University of Washington in the Department of Pediatrics and Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences. I'm trained as a pediatrician and environmental epidemiologist, and I focus, my research focuses on early life exposure to air pollution and effects on children's health. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Michael Kleinman.
Good morning. I'm Mike Kleinman. I'm at University of California, Irvine in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health with a secondary appointment in the School of Medicine. I'm an inhalation toxicologist, and my main focus is on health effects of ambient air pollutants.
Thank you. Next up is Donica Lombardozzi.
Hi, my name is Donica Lombardozzi, and I'm a project scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. My research related to this focuses on how ozone pollution affects plant photosynthesis and stomatoconductance and the ecosystem impacts that has.
Great, thank you. I think Howard Neufeld might not be here or might be late. Is Howard here? Okay, we'll move on to Jennifer Peel.
Good morning. I'm Jennifer Peel. I'm a professor of epidemiology at Colorado State University and the Colorado School of Public Health. And I'm an environmental epidemiologist with a focus on the health effects of air pollution.
Thank you. Rick Peltier.
Good morning. My name is Rick Peltier. I'm a professor of environmental health sciences at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. I'm an atmospheric chemist by training, and my expertise is in exposure assessment and analytical methods.
Thank you. Alexandra Panek-Gonzalez.
Hi, good morning. I'm an associate professor in the Department of City and Metropolitan Planning and the curator of urban ecology at the Natural History Museum of Utah at the University of Utah. I study atmosphere-biosphere interaction, specifically the ecological effects of atmospheric deposition.
Thank you. Jeremy Sarnett.
I am Jeremy Sarnett, and I'm going to, in the future, introduce myself the exact same way that Terry did. But for today, I will say that I'm at Emory, and I study air pollution and health using primarily molecular-based approaches, both targeted and untargeted. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. And Jason West.
I am Jason West in Environmental Sciences and Engineering at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm happy to be with you all. I work on, in this context, modeling ozone at local through global scales, radiative forcing of ozone, so effects of ozone on climate, and also health risk assessment of ozone. Thanks.
Okay, we'll move on to the next piece of our agenda, which is where I turn the meeting over to EPA and Erica Sasser and her colleagues to introduce themselves and to present the briefing.
Thank you, Leanne, and welcome everyone. Really glad you are with us. Many of you heard we had some technical difficulties in our conference room here. So you can see us in the conference room, but we will also, for those of us who are speaking, we will also be on individually by video. That will be simplest. Let me start by introducing myself, and then I will introduce my colleagues as we go around. I'm Erica Sasser. I'm the director of the Health and Environmental Impacts Division. So we are responsible for the policy assessment and the risk and exposure analyses for the NACs, as well as the rulemakings. We work in partnership with the Office of Research and Development in this work, and we really appreciate all of the time and effort that you as the CASAC and you as panel members put into this review. It's a lot. We know it's a lot. We're aware. We sent you 1,000 pages yesterday. So thank you in advance for the work that you are about to do. We have done our best to capture some of the discussions to date in the document that you received, and we're going to talk about that today, some of the changes that we made from the draft that you saw last spring. And we look forward very much to hearing your reactions and today your questions about the document. So With that, if I could ask Will to pull up the slides. Would be great. Thank you very much. So we're here today, obviously, to talk about the version 2, what we call V2, of the draft policy assessment for the reconsideration of the 2020 ozone NAAQS decision. And you can go on to the next slide. So by way of introduction, after a very brief introduction here, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Karen Wesson, who is the Ambient Standards Group Leader. And her team is here with me in the room, Lee Meyer, Mary Hudson, and Deirdre Murphy. So you see them listed there at the top of the slide. Karen is going to walk you through some things, and then Deirdre will walk you through other portions. Lee and Mary are here as well. They can answer questions as we go. We also have other folks listed here. John Langstaff is the exposure and risk lead, Ben Wells on air quality, our attorneys without whom we could not possibly do these reviews, and of course the entire team in ORD who are really important throughout the review process. You see some of the key folks listed on the slide, and certainly we're all here for your questions. So next slide, please. Today we're going to just briefly remind you what standards we're looking at, and then we're going to talk about the details of the policy assessment, including the primary standard and some of the updates that we've made, and the secondary standard. So that will be the run of show. You can go to the next slide. Just, I think everyone is familiar with this, but we have primary and secondary ozone standards that are identical in form, level, and averaging time. They are measured in terms of an 8-hour averaging time, measured as the annual 4th highest daily maximum 8-hour concentration over 3 years. And that level is 70 parts per billion. And so those are the standards that we are reconsidering. In 2020, the decision was made to retain those standards, which were set in 2015. Just as a brief reminder, you've seen this slide before, but just to orient folks, and I think this is actually important for the discussion that we're going to embark on. So let me just take a moment with this slide. The intent of the policy assessment is to fill the gap between the vast amount of scientific information that is contained in the integrated science assessment and the judgments that the administrator ultimately has to make. So the goal of this document is to narrow down and organize the science into a series of questions that facilitate decision-making. And the document is organized in that way. It tees up questions, and then it kind of goes through all the evidence and information and provides the staff summary answers as we see the evidence to those questions. And in a situation, in a new review, we always start with the same question, which is, does the available scientific evidence and the quantitative information from the risk and exposure assessment call into question the adequacy of the existing standards? For us, this question is a threshold question. It is the starting point. And from there, if we see new science, new quantitative analyses that might inform us differently than the previous review, we would say, yes, there is, or in this case, we would say yes. I'm going to the green box. We would say, yes, there is reason to call into question the adequacy of the standards. We might consider revising them. And then we would identify from there an array of potential alternatives that might be appropriate to consider. And that is laid out in the document in terms of what we're looking for input from you on. In the event that we don't see a lot of new information, either in terms of the volume of information or more importantly, in terms of the substance of what the information conveys, we might say in our view, there's not necessarily a need to call into question the adequacy of the standard, and we might consider retaining. So again, we would lay that information out for you. We would ask for your opinion on that, your judgments on the evidence and the quantitative information, and ask for you to advise the administrator in your own voice about your answers to those questions. So that is essentially what we are doing in the document that you have in front of you and that we will be considering as we go forward. Next slide. And so I'm going to now go on mute, and I'm going to pass over to Karen, who will turn on her camera and her microphone, and she's going to take you through the history of the last review and then into the discussion of the current review.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for your patience as far as the technical issues. I feel like in these days it happens all the time. So thank you. I am going to tag team this with Dr. Deidre Murphy, who's with me. We're going to walk through. We're going to start with walking through the primary standards slides. These slides are really meant to orient you and to give you the Cliff Notes version of Chapter 3. And then we'll pause and take questions. And then we'll do the same thing with Chapter 4, which focuses on the secondary standard. So looking at the primary standard, first let's start with the historical information that's considered in the draft PA. So in 2015, the current primary ozone standard was set at a level of 70 ppb. It was established based primarily on health effects evidence of respiratory effects and with a focus on quantitative exposure risk analyses that looked at analyses estimating exposures in children and children with asthma, which were both identified as the at-risk populations, and focused on looking at exposure to specific benchmarks of concern. In looking at the scientific information and the quantitative analyses, the administrator judged that a level of 70 ppb is estimated to protect 99% or more of children on average from one exposure of 70 ppb and almost eliminate repeated exposures to ozone concentrations at or above 70 ppb. 70 ppb was judged to be an important benchmark in noting that it was well below ozone concentrations shown in clinical studies to result in the widest range of respiratory effects, particularly looking at exposure concentrations to 80 ppb, where there were numerous studies that observed these effects, as well as 70 ppb being below 73 ppb, which was the lowest ozone exposure concentration shown in one clinical study to result in adverse combination of lung function decrements as well as respiratory symptoms. Further, the administrator noted decreased confidence in adverse effects occurring below 70 ppb to lower exposure concentrations, particularly noted uncertainty with single occurrences of these exposures. Nonetheless, looking at the data and the evidence, the administrator noted that a standard with a level of 70 ppb provided protection against these exposures. And particularly, she noted that a standard of a level of 70 ppb provided a margin of safety by protecting the large majority of children, about 96% to more than 99% of children in the urban study areas analyzed from experiencing 2 or more exposures of concern at a level of 60 ppb. This was a substantial reduction from those experienced under a standard level of 75 ppb. The administrator also noted important reductions in risk associated with ozone-induced lung function decrements. She also noted that while there was limited epidemiological evidence informing the decision, there was one U.S. single city study that showed positive associated asthma emergency department visits in an area that would have met a standard of 75 ppb, but not have met a standard level of 70 ppb. So turning now to the 2020 review. In that review, EPA looked at the scientific evidence and quantitative information. In looking at the 2020 ISA, EPA found that the scientific evidence evaluated was generally consistent with that in the 2015 review. Again, the strongest evidence was for respiratory effects caused by short-term ozone exposures, including health outcomes associated with asthma exacerbation in children with asthma. The newly available respiratory evidence did not include average exposure concentrations lower than those previously found in the controlled human exposures included in the 2015 review, and did not identify additional or different population groups to be at an increased risk. The 2020 ISA did include additional evidence, new evidence that did alter conclusions for cardiovascular effects and total mortality with respect to those causal determinations. Looking to the quantitative exposure risk analysis, we made improvements upon the quantitative analysis included in the 2015 review, reducing the uncertainties that were included in those analyses. And looking at the results from that work, we found that it yielded similar estimates to those found in the 2015 review. Those somewhat lower were similarly found similar protection provided against the respiratory effects. Looking at this evidence in the 2020 review, the administrator concluded that the scientific evidence and quantitative information did not call into question the adequacy of the primary standard, and thus the final decision was to retain the 2015 ozone primary standard. So moving to today, we are here to discuss the draft policy assessment, version 2. This policy assessment relies very heavily on the 2020 ISA, as well as on the exposure and risk analyses, pulling forward much of that analyses from the 2020 policy assessment. With regard to the scientific evidence, the draft policy assessment addresses the overarching question: does the available scientific evidence and exposure risk-based information call into question the adequacy of the public health protection afforded by the current primary ozone standard? It does so by considering a series of specific questions related to the following: the health effects associated with exposure to ozone, the public health implications, the at-risk populations and their sizes in the US, the exposure concentrations associated with health effects, as well as the important uncertainties, new or remaining since the 2015 review. Looking more closely at that health evidence, we look at the overview. The health effects evidence continues to be the strongest for respiratory effects. The 2020 ISA concluded that there was a causal relationship between short-term ozone exposure and respiratory effects, and a likely causal relationship for such effects with long-term exposure. Those conclusions were supported by an array of evidence. The most certain evidence comes from the controlled human exposure studies for an array of ozone-related respiratory effects, including reduced lung function, respiratory symptoms, and increased airway responsiveness, as well as inflammation. Those studies generally were studies that exposed largely healthy adults for 6.6 to 8 hours of ozone during quasi-continuous exercise. The conclusions were also based on a set of epidemiological evidence. That evidence showed a support for more serious health outcomes that were reported associations between short-term ozone exposure and respiratory hospital admissions and emergency department visits, as well as other respiratory health outcomes. The strongest evidence was seen for asthma-related outcomes, and specifically for children, asthma-related outcomes. So additionally, with respect to the public health implications of the evidence, the scientific evidence in the 2020 ISA indicated that the populations that were most at risk continued to include people with asthma, children, as well as outdoor workers. The strong and consistent epidemiological evidence demonstrated associations between ambient air ozone concentrations and hospital admissions and emergency department visits for asthma, with the strongest associations being for children. In addition, looking at the populations, people with asthma constitute approximately 8% of the US population. And we do note that there are higher percentages for some population subgroups. And then also the ISA noted that there was an increased risk for children and outdoor workers with respect to ozone exposure, noting that those tend to spend a greater time outdoors while at elevated breathing rates. So digging a little bit more into the health evidence and focusing on the associations across all of the evidence, we tend to look at 3 types of evidence. Evidence being controlled human exposure studies, epidemiological studies, and experimental animal studies. All of these studies have strengths and limitations, and we look at them and try to glean from them the information needed to support the review. With respect to the controlled human exposure studies specifically, those studies help elucidate ozone-related exposure factors and circumstances that elicit a specific type of health event. We keep in mind that those studies have endpoints that are limited to those that are less severe and reversible. Though they are also limited with respect to the influence of other ambient air exposures on the health outcomes given the chamber setups, and that they are generally performed on largely healthy adults. Though we do note there are some studies that include people with pre-existing conditions such as asthma, as well as children. We also look at the epidemiological studies. These studies are valuable in that they assess more severe health outcomes, such as emergency department visits and hospitalizations. They also tend to include an array of population subgroups, including children and people with a pre-existing disease. The exposures are assessed in context of ambient air. However, the ambient air metrics have to be used as surrogates for population exposure. So you're not specifically certain with respect to who's being exposed to what exactly. There are co-pollutant and pollution and population exposure histories as well that have to be taken into account that can contribute to potential uncertainties. And then last, we look to experimental animal studies. These studies help inform an understanding of ozone-specific responses, looking at mode of action. But we also note that these exposures are generally much higher than those in ambient air. And of course, we have to take into account the animal-human differences that can contribute to uncertainties. So looking more specifically into the controlled human exposure studies, the evidence from the controlled human exposure studies on exposure concentrations associated with respiratory effects in people and people without asthma include the following. There are studies that have found lung function decrements and respiratory symptoms in healthy adults exposed to 6.6 hours of exposure during exercise, generally being about 5 hours of moderate exercise in those studies. At 80 ppb, there are multiple studies that look at that exposure and the outcome following that exposure. Those studies find a wide range of respiratory effects, including average FEV1 decrements experienced of 5.5 to 7.8%. With respect to lower concentrations at 73 ppb, we have the Slagle study that found an outcome of respiratory symptoms and decreased lung function being experienced with an average FEV1 decrement of 6.1%. We note in the chapter that this combination of symptoms clearly meet the American Thoracic Society's definition of adverse. Looking to the lower concentrations included in those studies of 60 and 63 ppb, at these concentrations, there have been 3 studies, and in these studies, they found decreased lung function with an average FEV1 decrement of 1.7 to 2.9 in 3 of these studies. And in one of those studies, they also found an increased airway inflammation to be observed in some of the studies. These effects have the potential to be adverse and particularly if experienced repeatedly, as well as particularly if experienced across a large population. With respect to shorter exposure periods included in the studies, there are studies that look at 1 to 2 hours of exposure to ozone, generally with heavy intermittent or very heavy continuous exercise. The lowest exposure concentration In those studies for which there has been observed a statistically significant respiratory effect was 120 ppb. And so based on this information and using this, these sets of benchmarks, we then use this information to inform our health-based exposure benchmarks that are used in the quantitative assessment that's included in Chapter 3 of the policy assessment. And with that, I will turn it over to Deidre to go into some more details on those analyses.
Okay, and this is an easy handoff because it's the same computer. Thank you. Thank you for your patience on that. So with regard to the exposure and risk analysis, first, we'll note primary use of exposure and risk information is to inform our understanding of the potential frequency for exposures of concern to be experienced by at-risk populations, specifically considering children with asthma as an at-risk population for ozone during air quality conditions that just meet this current standard, being an issue of emphasis for us. The exposure and risk analyses in the draft PA were performed in 2020 by a cross-divisional team at OAQPS. We had air quality modelers and statisticians led by Shannon Koplitz and Ben Wells, and exposure and risk modelers led by Stephen Graham and John Langstaff. These analyses are presented in detail in appendices 3C and 3D, which I think make up the bulk of those 1,000 pages Erica referred to. The analyses employ a case study approach across 8 metropolitan study areas. In each study area, ambient air concentrations are estimated based on fusing air quality monitoring data and modeling estimates. Population exposures are estimated by exposure modeling that conceptually moves individuals through time and space and their activities during each day, based on sampling from EPA's comprehensive human activity database. Risk is characterized in 2 ways. First, by comparing estimated exposures at elevated ventilations to health-based benchmark concentrations based on controlled human exposures. And in these analyses, as in the analyses in 2015, those benchmarks are 60, 70, and 80 part per billion. The second type of analysis utilizes estimated exposures and ventilation rates in a model that estimates risk of lung function decremates to different exposures. So the 8 study areas meet several criteria. Each has at least 10 ambient air monitors during the 2015-2017 period, which was the data set that we started with. And based on data from these monitors during that time period, design values fell within 10 part per billion of the current standard level of 70. This reduced the extent of adjustments that were needed to develop the scenario for the air quality, to develop the air qualities that were assessed, which included the current standard. The population size in the CSA and MSAs represented by the study areas was between 2 and 10 million people. The team also considered air quality model performance and in these areas and geographic distribution of areas across the US, which you can see in the map. We did fairly well on that. These details are in Appendix 3D 2.1. And then to create, so focusing on the air quality modeling, which is described in detail in Appendix 3C, to create air quality for each of the scenarios assessed, a data set of hourly ozone concentrations was estimated by an approach drawing on monitoring data and modeling estimates. The ozone measurements provided fine scale, temporal, and broad spatial variability, and hourly concentrations were adjusted with spatially and temporally varying model-based factors, such that the highest design value in the study area just met the target for the air quality scenario. For example, for the current standard scenario, this would mean the highest location would have a design value just meeting 70 part per billion. This figure illustrates the variation in ozone concentrations across the Atlanta area with the once simulated, with the highest concentration location shown in yellow. That's the one just meeting the current standard. So this is illustrating the distribution of concentrations when the air quality is adjusted to just meet the current standard in Atlanta. And this comes from a figure on page, I think, figure 3C91 in the appendix. There are a whole series of them there. The exposures for the simulated individuals in each study area population were estimated using the agency's population-based air pollutant exposure model, or APEX, that links spatially and temporally varying ambient air ozone concentrations with study area population demographics, human activity data, and physiological attributes of the study populations. For the simulated individuals, the model estimates the complete time series of ozone exposures and simultaneously occurring breathing rates for these simulated individuals as they perform activities within the microenvironments they visit throughout their day. Based on these time series, the model counts the number of simulated people that are expected to experience ozone exposures at selected concentrations while at exertion rates of interest. We used APEX model outputs in two types of characterizations as mentioned previously. The first, comparison to benchmarks, presents the number and percent of the simulated populations in each study area that's estimated to experience exposures at or above benchmarks drawn from the controlled human exposure studies. The second, lung function risk, presents the number and percent of simulated populations in each study area estimated to experience lung function decrements of 3 magnitudes. We note that there are uncertainties associated with both approaches and some additional uncertainties that apply only to the estimation of lung function risk. So the next 2 slides provide some key results from the REA. The first is focusing on the comparison to benchmarks analysis, which is of the 2 analyses, the analysis that was emphasized in 2015 and in 2020. Summarized in the table shown on this page, you can see that across all eight study areas for air quality just meeting the current standard, less than 0.1% of children with asthma on average were estimated to experience as much as 1 day with an exposure of 7-hour concentration exposure at or above 80 part per billion. And no simulated individuals were estimated to experience more than 1 day with such an exposure. With regard to the 70 part per billion benchmark, which is below the exposure associated with the combination of statistically significant lung function decrements and respiratory symptoms, less than 1% on average of children with asthma were estimated to experience as much as 1 day with an exposure at or above 70, and less than 0.1% were estimated to experience more than 1 day. With regard to the lowest benchmark of 60 part per billion, which is in the bottom row, and looking to the far right, even in the highest year across all study areas, less than 5% of the population of children with asthma were estimated to experience more than 1 day with an exposure at or above 60 part per billion. Lastly, some observations on the exposure risk results. First, we note a strength of the comparison to benchmarks characterization is that it allows for consideration of the array of effects that are observed in the controlled human exposure studies rather than focusing on a prediction of one type of effect. Secondly, we observe that higher percentages of children than adults have exposure estimates at or above benchmarks, and this is due to the greater frequency and amount of time spent outdoors while at elevated exertion of children versus adults. Further, we note that there is similarity between the estimates for people with asthma and for all people, and this is due to the similarity in the activity patterns, particularly with regard to the 2 important factors of time outdoors and time at elevated exertion. In summary, while there are differences between the 2014 REA and the 2020 analyses, the 2020 exposure and risk estimates for air quality conditions just meeting the current standard are generally similar to those from the 2015 review, which are documented in the 2014 REA. A number of improvements have been made and uncertainties have been reduced since the 2015 review in a number of areas and further characterized in others. And this is documented in the appendices of the document. So the PA additionally considers the epidemiologic evidence with regard to informing our consideration of concentrations associated with effects that may be allowed by the current standard. As in the 2015, as in the 2015 review, there continue to be numerous epidemiologic studies that report positive associations of respiratory outcomes with ozone concentrations in ambient air. As noted in other NAAQS reviews, there is no specific point in the air quality distribution of any epidemiologic study that represents a bright line at or above which effects have been observed and below which effects have not been observed. Ozone epidemiological studies focus on multiple different metrics, including 1 hour and 8 hour seasonal averages, seasonal max averages, and 24-hour averages. Studies often report a study mean, and these values reflect the typical exposure concentrations seen in the study. But these study means cannot be compared directly to the level of the current standard, which is a peak-based form. Therefore, as in the 2015 review, we look to understand whether the air quality in the studies would have met the existing standard or not. For example, consistent repeated findings of positive associations of respiratory outcomes with ozone in studies at times and locations where the air quality would have met the current standard would signal a potential for the standard to be allowing air quality and associated exposures of concern, and a need for more detailed concern with regard to adequacy of the existing standard. Alternatively, associations in studies where the standard was not met, while still important evidence in considering ozone as a causative agent in health outcomes and therefore supporting why we have a standard, is not informative regarding exposure or air quality of interest in reviewing the standard. Next slide. Yes, thanks. With that backdrop and just focusing here on the respiratory outcome studies, we've summarized some of what's described in more detail in the PA. Among the 42 US and Canadian epidemiologic studies that find a statistically significant positive relationship of short or long-term ozone concentrations with respiratory outcomes, the vast majority were in locations and time periods that would not have met the current standard. More specifically, there are no US single or multi-city studies that would have met the current standard across the entire study period. 27 of the 32 US studies included no time period or location that met the standard at all. And there are no US multi-city studies that had more than 6% of the locations and time periods with air quality that would have met the standard. With regard to Canadian studies, based on the available measurements, we found that of the Canadian single city studies with locations that may have met the standard in some time periods, only 2 include locations for which the air quality would have met the current standard throughout the study. We note that studies did not include analyses of correlations with co-occurring pollutants. And as noted in 2015, with regard to the handful of Canadian multi-city studies that include any locations that would have met the current standard, there's uncertainty regarding the extent to which associations for a combined multi-city dataset are influenced by observations in the subset of cities that achieved versus didn't achieve the current standard. Thus, the extent to which these studies can inform identification of exposure concentrations likely to elicit health outcomes under air quality conditions meeting the current standard is limited. And now we're going to tag back to Karen.
So looking at the preliminary conclusions in the draft policy assessment version 2, the preliminary conclusions find that the health effects evidence newly available in the 2020 ISA is generally consistent with evidence based on the 2015 review. So the newly available respiratory effects evidence did not include average exposure concentrations lower than previously evaluated for effects in the controlled human exposure studies. The at-risk populations continue to include children and people of all ages with asthma. And the newly available epidemiological evidence continues to be limited in terms of linking adverse health outcomes to exposure concentrations under air quality meeting the current standards. The 2020 exposure risk analyses for air quality, looking at just meeting the current standard, finds estimates generally similar to those in the 2015 review. In summary of those analyses, more than 99.9% of children with asthma on average are protected from even a single exposure at or above 80 ppb, and 100% estimated to be protected from multiple exposures. More than 99.1% on average are estimated to be protected from even a single exposure at 70 ppb, and more than 99.9% are estimated to be protected from experiencing multiple exposures. And also more than 95% are estimated to be protected from experiencing multiple exposures at or above 60 ppb. Thus, the draft policy assessment concludes that the available evidence and quantitative information, including uncertainties, do not call into question the adequacy of protection provided by the current standard, and provide support for retaining the current primary standard. The draft policy assessment also recognizes that in the end, the decisions of the standards are judgments for the administrator. And as recognized by CASAC in 2014, different policy adjustments could support consideration of alternative levels for the standard from levels of 70 ppb down to 60 ppb. And with that, let me pause. Questions?
Thank you to EPA for that presentation. I open it up to the panel to see if anybody
Can't
has
hear.
any questions. You can raise your hand if, oh, Jeremy, are you raising your hand?
Yeah, sorry,
Yes,
I
that's
didn't
fine.
have, I wasn't quick enough to do the reaction.
That's fine.
So this is, I have a couple questions. I think I'll save some of them for the meeting after I've had a chance to kind of look at this, but just from a like a risk communication standpoint. So for the last slide with the preliminary conclusions from the risk assessment, and you presented the number of asthmatic kids that are likely to experience elevated exposures over the benchmarks. Would you also be able to provide the actual counts or the number of kids that might experience those exposures as well? I mean, you have 99.9% and 99 and 95% and stuff like that, but just in terms of getting some understanding of the scope of the population within the assessment and sort of the number of potential cases that we're looking at, I think that would be helpful to me to see those numbers as well.
And those numbers, sorry.
I'm sorry, I have not looked at the policy assessment. I haven't had a chance to look at the full document yet. So if they're in there, then I apologize for the question, but
You're excused, Jeremy. You only got it yesterday.
I've been working all night, but I just fell asleep at about page 500. No, I'm just kidding.
And that's where they would have been. No, so those, sorry, we get a feedback. I'm not sure how to.
Can you guys turn your speaker, use your speaker and your microphone? That's the problem. It's the two different machines. So something I can do about it.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. No echo.
Sorry, so, but we can't hear you guys. It's tricky, but I will just quickly say that yes, the results of the exposure analysis, the risk and exposure analyses for each of the study areas are shown in both counts, numbers of people. It does the population modeling, which is stochastically sampling and creating simulated individuals and relates them back to the population size of each study area. So the results are presented both in terms of total counts in the different for the different categories of results, and then also with regard to percentages. And those should be both in the chapter in section 3.4, and then also definitely in the appendices, that would be appendix 3D. And there is an attachment actually to appendix 3D that has ad nauseum all sorts of the results.
Thank you. I see that Mark has his hand up.
Yes, thanks for that very clear presentation. And I'm just for your comments on the risk assessment for the epidemiological studies. You point out that the vast majority of the studies were in areas that didn't meet the wouldn't have met the current ambient air quality standards. But of course, these exposures were at a range, and I think at least in the prior PA, there's a table showing mean levels of some of these studies, and there's a lot of them. The mean concentrations are 30 to 40 ppb, kind of in that range. So obviously, these studies involve a range of exposures. Was there any attempt to kind of select data from these studies, or maybe some of these studies did restrict their data to concentrations that would have met to the lower end of the concentrations to look for health effects and assess that impact?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First off, let me just back up, and I know, Dr. Frampton, that you're familiar with most of this, but I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. So mean concentrations, of course, vary across study areas, vary through time, but do not tell us whether or not that area was meeting the current standard. And when we're in the context of thinking about adequacy of the current standard, it's most informative to us to think about what associations with air quality there might be when we did not have the standard meeting the air quality, meeting the standard. Because if the standard is not meeting, if the standard is meeting the air quality, if the air quality is meeting the standard, then the variation in concentrations you see, if it's still associated with responses, significant responses, that's going to be of concern to us. And we're then going to want to dig in to figure out, well, what is driving that? What are the concentrations that might be eliciting that response? But when the air quality for the area is not meeting the standard, that's not going to address the context that matters to us, which if we control that air quality, do we still see it? If we don't control the air quality, i.e. the air quality is not meeting the standard, that's of less interest because we have a mechanism to control it. Do you see the trickiness of it? So, but we did not do additional analyses, and there were not, I don't believe, in any of the studies, some sort of analysis as you're responding or referring to.
Thank you. Jeremy, did you want to follow up on that?
No, I didn't want to follow up on that, but I did have actually another question. If anyone wants to follow up on that, I'll wait. Okay, so I just had just a clarification question about the exposure modeling. So you guys, for this assessment, also used Apex, and I'm curious whether or not there were any changes in the input parameters or the way that you applied Apex in this assessment compared to the 2014 one. And
yes.
what were the biggest kind of changes in those parameters that you applied this time around than compared to the previous assessment?
Right. There are a number, and they are summarized actually in section 3.4 in a set of bullets, which I'm not going to remember the page for, but it is in the early part of section 3.4, there's a set of bullets. And I will just relay some that strike me. There are others with regard to the air quality modeling, the monitoring, the adjustment approach, the selection of the study areas. The point of having the study areas have existing design values that did not need much adjustment is important, because in 2015, there were several study areas for which the adjustment was quite large in order to get to air quality that met 70. On the exposure modeling side, one thing we did was focus on exposure durations closer to the 6.6 hours of the study. So we looked at the 7-hour exposure period rather than averaging for 8 hours. We additionally did some additional detail on the ventilation rates, I believe, to fine tune the ventilation rates of interest based on the data we had for that. Those are the two big population exposure modeling factors I recall.
Thank you. I'll look at section 3.4 as well.
All right, I guess next up is Judy Chow.
Yeah, I have a question on the exposure and risk assessment risk analysis performed in 2020, focus on those 8 metropolitan study area. And you say it's evenly distributed. I don't see Pacific Northwest, where Leon is. And my real question is that besides the Pacific Northwest, that it like the Sacramento has surprised me, because if you look at California, the Central California, Southern California are more important than more representative than Sacramento. And then seems like you avoid the ozone, high ozone or ozone non-attainment area. The reason I mentioned San Joaquin Valley is because they have the highest instance of respiratory disease and the symptoms. And I don't know if they meet the criteria or not, but I do know they have fairly high concentration.
Right, and that's exactly the reason that we were not able to use it because, as we said, we were looking to not have to make large adjustments to the air quality, because what we were interested in is not like existing air quality in area, particularly if that area is not meeting the standard. We were looking to understand what was the exposure and risk associated with an area with patterns of ozone concentrations that did meet the standard. And so the objective in getting lots of different study areas was a recognition that in each study area, there's going to be a different pattern of ozone concentrations, but each of them would be meeting the current standard or the alternative scenarios we did. So the reason Sacramento didn't make the cut, and believe me, it was considered, had to do with those high concentrations and the size of the adjustment that would be needed. I believe with regard to the Northwest, the issue had to do with that time period was also an issue. There was a wildfire time period, a lot of wildfires in that time period, if I recall correctly. And the modelers were very worried about how that was going to affect what they were doing for model performance.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Thank
Deirdre, do you want me to speak a little bit to this?
Sure. Heather Simon, who was key in the modeling group with Shannon that did that work.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the premises, one of the reasons we were trying to select areas that didn't have super high air quality or ozone concentrations is because we're relying on the modeling to adjust the ozone concentrations to look like what we think they would look at like if we were meeting the standard. And so we think that there's more uncertainty when we're relying on the model to do these kind of bigger adjustments. And so if the area is pretty close to the standard to begin with, then we don't have to do kind of as drastic a model perturbation to get the area to look like what it would if it were meeting the standard, if that makes sense. So it was intended to reduce the uncertainty associated with relying on the model to simulate these very large perturbations in ozone compared to what was actually measured in reality. And one of the other issues with the Northwest, you know, we had considered Seattle initially, but the structure of the ozone monitors in Seattle is such that I think there's one monitor in the city, but most of the monitors in Seattle are in fairly unpopulated areas. So there's a population in Seattle that don't have any monitoring data. So we just felt like the monitoring network in Seattle didn't actually capture what people were being exposed to, because most of the monitors were further from the population centers.
But there are more the fires over the period of 2015, 2017 would have also impact Sacramento area.
We did not do, that was not one of the studies.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Yeah, Sacramento was
Oh, I'm
included.
sorry.
I think, you know, in 2015, we looked at Seattle, as a potential area and found that we just didn't feel like the monitoring network in that city was sufficient to capture what people were actually being exposed to. I mean, the monitoring networks are designed to capture maximum ozone concentrations and not designed necessarily to capture population exposure. And in some cities, they do a better job of capturing what people are actually being exposed to. But Seattle happened to be one where we didn't feel like it was sufficient for the analysis we wanted to do.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry for misspeaking about Sacramento. I had LA in my head. Sorry.
All right, thank you. I think we're ready to move on to Ed Abel.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a comment and a question. In delineating the advantages and differences between the EPI studies, the clinical exposure studies, and the animal studies, you mentioned specifically that with regard to the population exposure studies, that the exposure histories sort of complicated that or made it a challenge. But I just would note that the previous exposure histories, and we had a long discussion about this when we talked about the ISA, can certainly complicate the clinical exposure studies as well for bringing people in based on what they've been exposed to. And so my question for you is, were you trying to make a specific point about the relative merit of one over the other there? Because if so, I think you need to also think about the clinical studies too in that light.
No, I think it's a hard thing to articulate, but I think it has to do with the fact that in the epidemiologic, the observational studies, it's all we're looking at relationships with the air quality, and the prior air quality that the people saw is maybe related to the current air quality. So there may be relationships of across the air quality as well as that they are influenced by it, which is different than in the controlled human exposure studies, because you're then adding exposure, and that's the association you're looking at. You're not also it's obviously we haven't come up with the best way to articulate it, Dr. Abel.
I just want to make sure that that you're seeing the complication in
Your
both
point.
ways all at once.
Well made.
Thank you.
George.
Thanks. I have a kind of a 30,000-foot question. CASAC's 2022 review and comments on the 2020 ISA apparently triggered this revision to the April 2022 PA. Today's presentation doesn't make any mention of that, and I'm not sure if it's covered in the PA. Could you comment on what, if anything, from last fall's ISA review drove this revision, and also related, are there any major changes to this PA for the primary standard? We're not talking secondary here, relative to the 2022 version.
Yes, and so we did look closely at the letter that we received from CASAC at the end of 2022, paying particular attention to where recommendations were made specific to the PA. And in those instances, we then tried to consider that in terms of the new version that you see now. The area with regard to the primary standard that I'd point to is the additional and more detailed discussion of the epidemiologic evidence, because that was an area of interest expressed by the CASAC. And so you'll see in section 3.3.3 is much expanded in that regard, as well as the associated appendix. That's one example, probably the primary one for the primary standard chapter.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions or comments at this time? Okay, not seeing any hands up. I propose that we take a 5-minute break before we move on to the secondary standard.
Leanne or Aaron, a quick question. Do you think we will be finished well before 3 o'clock?
I guess that depends on how fast the secondary standard discussion goes, but it looks like we're headed that way, but I guess it remains to be seen.
Okay, thanks.
All right, we didn't set a timer this time, but I see EPA has their video back on and I'm ready. So unless anybody, looks like a couple other panelists are back. So I think we can start with the secondary standard, assuming EPA is ready for that.
We think so.
Okay, oh, sorry. Okay, well, we were thinking maybe we had solved our problem.
We may.
Well,
we have. Let's
over
try
the
this
break.
time.
Okay, but we'll just continue with this approach to be on the safe side. So moving to the secondary standard. So similarly, what we want to do is walk you through some summary slides of the conclusions in chapter 4 on the secondary standard. And so I'm going to start with some historical information and the approach in the draft PA. So the current secondary ozone standard was established in 2015. It was based primarily on welfare evidence for vegetation effects and air quality analyses that focused on protection that was provided against those cumulative exposures, particularly associated with growth-related impacts of concern. In that review, there was a focus on reduced growth in tree seedlings, particularly in terms of the relative biomass loss, or RBL, which was used as a proxy or surrogate for the full array of growth-related effects seen in that review, ranging from organism level up to ecosystem level. Similar to the primary standard, the draft PA version 2 relies primarily on the 2020 ISA and extensively draws from the 2020 policy assessment. At the CASAC November 2022 recommendation in your letter, the draft policy assessment also considers the Lee et al. 2022 study as part of the evidence base in this chapter. The quantitative exposure and risk analyses that you'll see in chapter 4 has been expanded, and it's been updated from those in the 2020 policy assessment. You'll note in 2020 technical memos that supported that decision being pulled forward and being included in the chapter. You will also note that in this version too, that there has been an update to the air quality data and to analyses to include a more recent time period of 2018 to 2020. In looking at the reconsideration with regard to the scientific evidence, the draft PA addresses the overarching question: does the available scientific evidence and exposure risk-based information call into question the adequacy of the public welfare protection afforded by the current secondary ozone standard? In doing so, the policy assessment steps through a series of specific questions related to the nature of welfare effects associated with exposure to ozone, the public welfare implications of such effects, the exposures and potential for public welfare effects under conditions that meet the current standard, with a focus on metrics and quantitative relationships with ozone for various welfare effects associated with the various range of endpoints assessed. Also looking at air quality and exposures, particularly in areas meeting the current standard, and the potential for effects occurring in such areas. The policy assessment also addresses important uncertainties and new or remaining uncertainties from the 2015 review. Looking at the welfare effects evidence, the nature of effects is generally consistent with that identified in the 2015 review. The 2020 ISA again concludes a range of causal relationships related to ozone exposure, including those for endpoints related to visible foliar injury and effects on plant growth and reproductivity. In addition, it also concludes that there are multiple likely to be causal relationships related to ozone exposure, including endpoints related to effects on carbon sequestration and ecosystem water cycling. In addition, there's an expansion from the 2015 review in the 2020 ISA. that includes multiple new endpoints that have been found to be likely causally related to exposure to ozone. Those include increased tree mortality as well as altered plant insect signaling. In addition, the policy assessment looks at the public welfare significance associated with the effects and considers things such as the type of effect, the public uses of potential impacted areas and the associated public values, the extent of potentially impacted areas, severity, and the extent of the potential for impacts.
Okay, sorry, it's a handoff. So as discussed in section 433 of the draft PA, there's variation across the categories of effects with regard to the availability of established robust quantitative relationships with ozone exposure metrics that can inform our understanding of risk under conditions meeting the current standard. And uncertainties remain from the 2015 review and with the new evidence. However, the longstanding evidence documents the importance of cumulative exposure and the need for attention to high hourly concentrations. Starting first with growth-related effects, the evidence continues to support the use of reduced growth in tree seedlings in terms of a relative biomass, or RBL, as a proxy or surrogate for the full array of growth-related effects from organism to ecosystem level, as was used in the 2015 decision, with W126 index as the exposure metric. The 2015 standard was based on generally limiting cumulative exposures to those for which the median RBL estimate across the studied species would be somewhat below 6%, which corresponds to a W126 index of 19 part per million based on the evidence at that time. So after folding in a recent study recommended by CASAC last fall, the draft PA describes the availability of quantitative ER relationships for W126 index in terms of a 92-day, 12-hour metric and RBL for seedlings of 17 tree species based on experimental studies involving a range of exposure concentrations and statistical analyses. These come from two sets. First, the established ER functions for 11 species described in Lee and Hogsett 1996, which are recognized in multiple criteria documents and ISAs, and which played a key role in the 2015 establishment of the current standard. These ER functions derive functions for each species based on the composite or median derived from experiment-specific functions that reflect differing durations and time of harvest for the responses. The durations in these experiments range from 55 days, treatments in 55 days, to treatments covering 550 days spread over 1 or 2 years. And the time of harvest may be immediately at the end of a season of exposure, or maybe just prior to another season of exposure. And that was done to take into account the potential variability in when the response was assessed. The second set of functions, it comes from Lee et al. 2022. That includes ER functions for 16 species, including 10 of the previously studied 11 species. 10 of the previously studied 11 species. The species-specific functions in Lee et al. Are derived from statistical modeling applied to all the species data sets with exposures adjusted to a 92-day W126 index and with variations in model structure and the parameters included intended to account for differences among the species data sets. For both approaches, derivation of the 92-day functions from these exposures that were of multiple differing durations, including across multiple years, involves a type of scaling, the underlying assumption of which is akin to an averaging of exposure. As could be expected, the different approaches yield variations in the functions for species common between the two analyses. So secondly, there are two additional findings that can be drawn from Lee et al., and they're noted in the PA. The first is with regard to peak concentrations. Individuals of the two species with experiments in which patterns of peak hourly concentrations differed despite similar W126 index values exhibited different responses. Specifically, significantly lower total biomass response was found for exposures of similar W126 index, but lower peak concentration pattern and a lower N100. Secondly, with regard to multi-year exposure response, for 3 of the 4 species assessed, the response to 2 years of ozone exposure was not greater than the response to a single year. For one of the species, ponderosa pine, a greater reduction in growth was observed after 2 years than after 1 year, but the effect was less than additive, i.e. the second year response was not as much as the first year response. We recognize some uncertainties in the RBL estimates, not with regard to whether ozone affects growth, which decades of evidence document, but related to the interpretation of these estimates in exposure circumstances common for recent air quality, particularly for air quality occurring with the current standard. With regard to W126 index, uncertainty relates to the ER function data sets inclusion of treatments with W126 index values ranging well above the values occurring with air quality that meets the current standard. And the derivation of standardized functions for a 92-day, 12-hour W126 index from experiments that ranged widely in duration includes inherent associated uncertainties. And W126 index does not always reflect the frequency of incidence of high ozone hours. With regard to peak hourly concentrations, the exposure response function data sets include many treatments with numerous hours of ozone concentrations at or above 100 part per billion, and very limited representation of peak hourly concentration patterns that are more common and that occur under the current standard. The recent study by Lee et al. Finds that hourly concentration patterns with higher and or more frequent peaks have a greater impact on growth for the same cumulative exposure measured by or assessed by a W126 index. In the area of multiple year exposures, the recent and prior exposure response analyses indicate that subsequent exposure years can have a lesser response than the initial exposure years, with variation observed across species. So, in identifying target W126 index values based on the now somewhat expanded information, we considered ER functions from both studies in a manner consistent with the administrator's judgment in 2015 and 2020 to use the median RBL across species for which we have ER functions as a surrogate or proxy for the broad array of growth-related effects, recognizing associated uncertainties and with attention to a median RBL below 6%. In addition to considering the cross-species median RBL that would be estimated by each of the 2 sets of functions separately, the 2 sets of RBL estimates are also considered in combination. In the combined approach, for the 10 species common to the 2 analyses, the resulting RBL estimates are simply averaged. This combined consideration recognizes that both approaches to deriving species-specific functions for a 92-day W126 index metric have strengths and limitations, with neither approach clearly superior to the other. Looking across the estimates from both species and in combination, we can see in the table on this slide that the species median RBL is 6% for a W126 index ranging from 19 part per million to just below 24 part per million for the combined approach, or higher based on a function drawn simply from the recent study. So now turning to visible foliar injury, the policy assessment notes a quantitative relationship of severity or incidence of visible foliar injury in natural areas has not been established with a specific ozone metric. Studies of relationships between ozone exposure and incidence or severity of injury suggest a role for peak concentration occurrence, such as with an N100 metric, as well as cumulative exposures, such as using a W126 index. The PA analyses of a data set developed from 6 years of US Forest Service scores at biosites in 39 states indicate that visible foliar injury of some extent occurs across a range of W126 index estimates. And the analysis in Appendix 4C of the draft PA shows that when the information is binned by W126 index across these bins, the biosite scores and incidence observed is variable, with the incidence and severity increased really in the highest bin, above 25 part per million hours, which is a magnitude not observed in recent air quality in areas that meet the current standard. The current evidence is also limited with regard to judging the public welfare significance of different levels of severity or extent of injury. While appreciably severe and extensive damage is reasonably considered significant from a public welfare perspective, and a single leaf injury is reasonably considered not all that significant, evidence to inform consideration or judgments for intermediate levels is unclear. For two other categories of effects, there is less availability of quantitative information. With regard to climate effects, while tropospheric abundance of ozone is causally related to radiative forcing and likely causally related to effects on temperature, precipitation, and related variables, there's appreciable uncertainty associated with understanding the quantitative relationships involving regional ground level ozone concentrations near the Earth's surface and the climate effects of tropospheric ozone on a global scale. And for newly identified vegetation-related effects, such as plant insect signaling, there's a lack of information on the relevant exposure metric and quantitative ER relationships, as well as inconsistent directionality of associations for some effects. With this backdrop of exposure conditions of interest, we look to the air quality information to inform whether the current standard will provide air quality, controlling both cumulative ozone exposures in terms of WN26 index and controlling peak hourly concentrations, such as in terms of N100. Air quality analyses of the recent 3-year period and also the longer-term record over the last 19 3-year periods at U.S. monitoring sites finds that a positive relationship between W126 index and design values for the current standard that indicates that reductions in design values are associated with reductions in W126 index values. Lower peak concentrations and fewer occurrences of high concentrations, such specifically looking at lower N100, occurs at sites that meet the current standard, and this indicates the control that is exerted by the form and averaging time of the current standard on peak concentrations. Further, analyses indicate that W126 index alone is less controlling of peak concentrations. At monitoring sites, including class 1 areas that met the current standard, W126 index values rarely approached a value associated with a 6% RBL as a median across the studied species. For the most recent period, the 3-year average W126 index values were at or below 17 part per million hours. Looking back to 2000, all of the 3-year average W126 index values were at or below 19 part per million hours, with the higher values of 18 or 19 occurring in the earlier years. And with regard to single-year W126 index, well over 99% of the values across the historic database were at or below 19 part per million hours.
So in chapter 4, the preliminary conclusions included there looked at the welfare evidence and found it generally consistent with the evidence base in the 2015 review. With respect to growth-related effects, it found that the evidence supported the use of the RBL as a surrogate for a broader array of vegetation-related effects, and also that supported the consideration in the context of air quality and exposure conditions meeting the current standard. It noted a continued role for the cumulative exposure W126 metric, as well as the role of peak ozone exposures. With respect to visible foliar injury, the policy assessment concludes that there is a role of peak ozone concentrations in damaging leaves. The evidence does not indicate air quality conditions associated with elevated severity or extensive leaf damage to be occurring in areas that meet the current standard. With respect to climate effects, the evidence does not support climate risk estimation for ozone concentrations that meet the current standard. The air quality exposure analyses included in chapter 4 indicate that the current standard controls both W126 levels as well as peak hourly concentrations, providing protection for air quality conditions associated with vegetation-related risk of concern. In concluding, the draft policy assessment finds that the available evidence and quantitative information, including uncertainties, do not call into question the adequacy of protection provided by the current standard and provide support for retaining the current standard. Draft policy assessment concludes that the W126 index remains the appropriate metric for assessing cumulative ozone exposures, and also finds that the current standard provides control of W126 levels of concern. The form and averaging time of the standard are not required to match those of the exposure metrics, but rather the administrator considers whether the standard in all of its elements provides requisite protection against effects characterized of exposures of concerns in terms of such metrics. The draft policy assessment also recognizes that in the end, the decisions of the standards are judgments of the administrator, and that different judgments might lead to consideration of alternative options. Accordingly, the draft policy assessment notes that if the administrator judges that it is more appropriate to consider an alternative option to the existing standard, such an option could be a combination of two standards: a W126 index-based standard for which a range of levels supported by the evidence might extend from 17 ppm hours to just below 24 ppm hours, and a standard that controls hourly peak concentrations for which a precise range of levels might be extended to achieve a level of peak concentration control compared to that achieved by the existing standard. And with that, let me pause and take questions.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I open it up to the panel for any questions or comments. I'm not an expert in this area of science, but I have to say that that presentation was very helpful in terms of understanding how you went through a review of potential alternative metrics and the conclusions you reached. I'm sure we will have comments about this, but it doesn't seem like anybody has any clarifying questions or other comments to make at this time.
I have a question. This is Donica.
Okay.
Unfortunately, we lost power at my house partway through this presentation, so I missed a lot of it, and I'm curious if you would be willing to provide some of the slides. I can also look at the document. I just haven't had a chance to do that since we just got it yesterday. But I should also say thank you for putting this together, and I'm sorry that I ended up missing part of it.
Yeah, we do have the slides. Erin sent them to us yesterday. I think they came in an earlier email, so it's easy to lose track of all the details when stuff's coming at us in rapid fire. So we do have that presentation. So you will have time. You have a month now.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Not that
That's perfect. I'll look. I just can't access any of my email or anything without power and internet. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Point noted. So I actually have a question unrelated to the secondary standard that I thought would be helpful just to hear today. And that is that you provided us with an updated version of the Duffney memo and the erratum sheet. And I thought for me, it would be helpful if you just talked us through that a little bit and give us whatever insight you care to provide on that work.
Okay, well, we are going to do the computer slide over to Dr. Mary Hudson.
Hi. Yeah, so Dr. Frampton had noted a few mistakes in some of the tables where the concentrations were listed. The errata sheet notes where those are. I believe the concentrations were changed from 100 to 120 parts per billion in some of the characterizations of the studies. And going through it, also ORD found a few other things that they wanted to update and correct. So it does not change any of the conclusions of the memo. It just clarifies some of the specifics of the data that's presented.
So not having looked at this in detail in a while, is it fair to characterize that the memo is more or less the same as it was with a few minor changes?
Yes, yes. It corrects some of the data points that were we were reporting study evidence, and the data points were incorrectly. I think there was one or two concentrations that were incorrectly attributed. So yeah, so none of the conclusions have changed versus the overall memo. It's just the details, some of the typos essentially.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. That's helpful. I think it's helpful to those of us looking at things to know what to focus on also. So I'm looking to the panelists to see if you have any additional questions or comments for EPA. This is our chance in advance of our deliberations to get any more information from EPA. I want to note that historically, before the pandemic and the age of Zoom, we used to get the briefing from EPA in the first couple hours of the meeting after we had done all our homework. And, I personally find this super helpful to have the briefing from EPA in advance of having done the homework, because it helps us understand your thinking and get more background that we don't have to glean by ourselves. That said, I can see how that leads to less discussion and questions at this time because we haven't dug into the document. So I think this is a great new model, but maybe has less discussion with EPA than we will expect to have when we meet in person in March. So give one more second to see if anybody else has anything you wish to address. Okay, not seeing anything. I wish to thank EPA for your thorough presentation and for your helpful answers to all our questions. I note for the panelists that we have now provided you with assignments for the review. In making the assignments, Erin and I tried to balance the expertise among panelists with the individual workload and tried to not assign too many sections to any individual. That said, all panelists are welcome to comment on all parts of the policy assessment, regardless of the assignments. And in addition, based on some of the questions and comments today, I'm thinking that I may suggest a few changes to assignments, and Erin and I will follow up with individuals about this separately. So as we've said, our next meeting will be in March 29th to 30th in North Carolina. And I now turn the meeting back over to Erin to give us any final instructions and to adjourn.
Yeah, I don't have any additional instructions. I think Leanne covered it all there. We will see you all in March, at the end of March in North Carolina. Thank you again, everyone, for your participation. We can be adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.